Okay, I've said before that total war, as we're going to define it, consists of two elements. The first is the complete or near complete mobilization of a society for war. And you don't get that really until you get industrialization uh, and uh, and modern abilities for propaganda and dissent, and you add those to um, existing elements of this kind of mobilization, particularly nationalism. You put all that together, and you've got the ability to extract complete or near complete manpower resources from a society and economic resources from a society. So that's part one. Now, what we're going to do is looking at the application of violence against a broad spectrum of the enemy society. That's the second part of the definition of total war. And I'm going to deal with this by way really of examples. During what's called the Second Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, in addition to the manufacturing of iron and steel and so on, you also get the beginnings of the modern uh, chemical industry on a very large scale. And one of the things that emerges from this modern chemical industry is the rise of high explosive. Up until this time, you're dealing with gunpowder as the basis of explosions, and there's real maximum on the amount of explosive power that you can get from gunpowder. But the modern chemical industry creates high explosive. Dynamite is an example of this kind of high explosive, and there are other examples as well. And it's these high explosives that make possible the much larger cannon that are used during the First World War and the primacy of artillery on the battlefield with these high explosive shells of tremendous blast and concussive power. During the First World War, an estimated 70% of military casualties come from artillery fire. But probably the most graphic and disturbing element of the impact of the chemical industry on warfare is the use of gas warfare. This was used by the Germans in for the first time in April 1915, when they had brought canisters of chlorine gas to the front lines and released them, and this gas went across no man's land to enemy lines, and the soldiers on the other side had no idea what was coming. They had no protection from it, and they found themselves this chlorine kind of reaching their lines, and then because it's somewhat heavier than air, dropping down into their trenches and asphyxiating them. And of course, what you do in a situation like that is you simply run away. The Germans counted on this. They made an attack based upon this. The attack was botched. It didn't get anywhere, but it led to the use of gas warfare on both sides. Both sides developed gas masks as a protection against this. They even put gas masks on horses, even on dogs that were used for communication purposes, believe it or not. And they developed other kinds of gases as well. The worst of these was probably mustard gas, which was a kind of gas that wasn't necessarily lethal, but it was incapacitating because it created second degree burns over any part of the body, over exposed body, over any part of the skin that it touched. And this included mustard gas getting into the lungs, where people suffered scarring in their lungs, sometimes lifetime scarring from the effects of mustard gas, and also mustard gas in their eyes, which could produce temporary and sometimes permanent um, blindness. So you had the use then of gas warfare as one example of this full spectrum of violence. A second example was the bombing of civilians. Now, this occurred on a very large scale, a massive scale, during the Second World War. But because we're dealing with total war as an overall phenomenon. We're not going to get into the Second World War specifically, but hundreds of thousands of people were killed during the Second World War from what was so-called strategic bombing. The Americans and the British did most of this, but the Germans and to some extent the Japanese did some as well. The Americans and the British simply had a much larger capacity for engaging in this kind of large-scale bombing, and they developed this capability during the interwar period and utilized it very extensively during the Second World War. But bombing of civilians begins during the First World War. And the illustration here is of a single child who's been killed in the aftermath of a German Zeppelin raid on London. And Zeppelins were somewhat like blimps, like the Goodyear blimp. You see that sometimes, except that these were larger and they were rigid airships that had hydrogen as a means of keeping them aloft, and they could move for hundreds of miles. And the Germans launched attacks against London and other cities using these Zeppelins, with the idea really of terrorizing the British civilian population. Nobody knew at that time what the reaction of bombing of civilians was going to do. The idea might be that they were so terrified that they would rush to their governments and say, you've really got to make peace. We can't deal with with this helpless feeling that we get when the enemy is able to rain down bombs upon us with impunity. This didn't work out. During the interwar period, there was a renewed idea that if you could bomb civilians severely enough, that they would put pressure on their governments to end the war. It never worked. It never worked. And so on the part of the Americans anyway, during the Second World War, strategic bombing was aimed increasingly at manufacturing centers. But because of imprecise bombing techniques, these attacks also killed a lot of civilians. And the British, who committed themselves during the Second World War to night bombing, found that they could hit nothing larger than the built-up part of a city. And so, that is what they did. And on the part of the Americans, the idea was to destroy the economic capability of an enemy to make war. On the part of the British, the idea was one of demoralizing the German population. And then ultimately, this World War II strategic bombing takes the form of the atomic bombing by the United States of Japan, in specifically the bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, when the first atomic bomb was dropped on Japan. And then just 3 days later, August 9th, 1945, when a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The Hiroshima bomb, we think, killed over 100,000 Japanese outright. The Nagasaki bomb, we think, killed about 35,000. Unless you think that these numbers were in some way unusual, from March 1945 on, this is months before Hiroshima, the American Air Forces were dropping bombs on numerous Japanese cities, starting with Tokyo. The first raid on Tokyo occurred on March 6, 1945, and resulted in about 100,000 deaths on that single night. And so this idea of bombing of civilians as being somehow legitimate, which begins during the First World War and results in a fairly limited amount of civilian deaths in the First World War because of the limited capacity to deal these destructive energies upon a civilian population. This opens the Pandora's box to the exponentially worse bombing attacks that occurred during the Second World War. You also get during the First World War the phenomenon of unrestricted submarine warfare. Since time immemorial, merchant vessels had gone back and forth, bringing supplies to countries that were at war, and there had always been techniques available to stop those merchant vessels from reaching the ports of an enemy country. You could attempt to seize those merchant vessels on the ocean, and then what you would do is you would take the crew prisoner, and you would take a portion of your own crew, put it aboard the captured merchantman, and then sail it to a friendly port where you would sell off the goods. Um, that was a common method that went back for centuries. There was also the phenomenon of the blockade, whereby you would place ships off the entrance to an enemy port and prevent any vessel from getting into the port. So, and these were both ways that were effective in terms of stopping enemy vessels or enemy merchant vessels from bringing supplies to an enemy country. But with the advent of the submarine, you see the submarine at the top there. This is a German U-boat, as they were called. The German word for submarine is Unterseeboot, so starts with a U, called U-boat. And these U-boats did not have the ability to safely surface and stop a merchant vessel, and they did not have the crew capacity to take crewmen and put them on the merchant vessel and take them as a prize. You didn't have anywhere near the space to put an enemy crew aboard your own vessel, and so the only thing that a U-boat could do would be to torpedo an enemy vessel. And so, and you couldn't always tell, from under the waves, looking at an enemy ship through a periscope, what was a merchant vessel and what was an ocean liner. And then you also had to wonder, is the ocean liner also carrying supplies to the enemy country? And so, if you look here, you'll see this pink area. You will see that in early 1915, the Germans just declared a war zone around Great Britain and Ireland. Ireland was then at this point, in essence, a colony of Great Britain, and the idea was they gave warning that if any vessel at all came within that area, it was going to be considered to be a legitimate target of U-boat attack, and this was considered to be a barbaric policy. And quite early on, it made worldwide headlines when a very large British ocean liner, almost as large as the Titanic, was torpedoed, with a loss of over 1,200 civilian lives off the coast of Ireland, May 7th, 1915. These deaths included those of 127 Americans. And President Woodrow Wilson of the United States protested vigorously against this kind of warfare and forced the Germans to back off on it for a period of time. Subsequently, though, the Germans became so desperate to stop the British that they renewed unrestricted submarine warfare in early 1917. And there are a number of reasons why the United States got involved in the First World War, but a significant one is the fact that the Germans renewed submarine warfare. But this unrestricted submarine warfare, in which civilian lives and military lives, there was no distinction made between them, is also an element of this application of violence against a broad spectrum of an enemy society. Then a phenomenon that you have during the First World War is simply one of mass slaughter. This particular graph says that 10 million died during the First World War. This would be 10 million military deaths. We're not talking about civilian deaths. And this idea of mass slaughter is interesting in as much as nationalism, and and the idea then that a nation, all the people in a nation, needed to sacrifice on behalf of their country. And then the idea that so much blood has been lost in these battles that we can't quit now, that we have to put more manpower, more effort, so on, into the war effort, you know, results in millions upon millions of military deaths during the Civil War. To say nothing of all during the First World War, to say nothing at all about the um, of the civilian deaths that were also involved. Okay, I'm going to stop here again. We'll pick up the story again on the other side. Okay. Okay. I'll see you in a bit.